Saturday afternoon. Smoke curls up. Neighbors wave from their porches. Then Diane marches over. Phone already dialed to 911. I'm reporting this immediately, she snaps. Loud enough for the whole street.
Curtin Twitch.
Phone's already filming. I keep flipping burgers. Her voice cracks. Just for a second. Like she senses something's wrong. 2 patrol cars turn the corner. And she smiles like she's already won. My name is Marcus Webb. 38 years old. A retired Army Master Sergeant who spent 14 years overseas before coming home to teach JROTC at the local high school. My wife Denise works as a pediatric nurse. 2 years ago, we bought our first house in Maple Ridge Estates, a quiet subdivision we dreamed about since our wedding day. We have 2 kids, Jaden, 10, and Amara, 7, who love riding bikes down our cul-de-sac. I built a small vegetable garden along the fence and set up a second-hand grill on the patio. Life felt settled, ordinary, exactly what Denise and I had promised each other after all those deployments apart. Diane Whitfield ran the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association like her own private kingdom, and everyone on the block knew it. She'd been president for 9 years, reviewing paint colors, mailbox styles, even the height of hedges personally, and nobody dared challenge her without facing a fine in their mailbox within days. The day we moved in, Diane stood at the end of our driveway with a clipboard, watching the movers carry boxes inside. She introduced herself with a tight smile and said, "We like to keep things a certain way around here," before walking off without asking our names. At first I brushed it off. New neighborhoods took adjusting to, and not every awkward greeting meant something deeper. Denise wasn't so sure. She noticed how Diane lingered a beat too long on our skin before glancing at the moving truck. Like she was doing quiet math. Weeks passed, and small things added up. Our trash cans got a citation for being visible 1 day early, something 3 other houses did weekly without a single notice. Our porch light was too bright. Our flagpole was improperly anchored. Always us, never anyone else on the street. At the welcome barbecue that spring, other neighbors were warm, curious, kind. Mr. brought over tamales. The Chens across the street invited Jaden to swim in their pool. But whenever Diane passed our yard, her smile disappeared like a switch had been flipped. I started noticing patterns other black families in town whispered about. A lawsuit 2 subdivisions over. An HOA president fined for selective enforcement. Stories that never made headlines but circulated at church and barbershops. Maple Ridge, turned out, had its own quiet reputation nobody wanted to say aloud. One evening, Mr. Alvarez pulled me aside at the mailbox. "Watch yourself with Diane," he said low, glancing over his shoulder. "She's been HOA president since before I bought this house. People who cross her don't stay long. One way or another." I asked what he meant. Some families had moved out within a year of buying, worn down by fines, liens, and legal letters that always seemed to follow one particular family type. He wouldn't say more. Denise found an old community Facebook group, buried under years of posts. Comments from a family who'd left in 2019 described nearly identical treatment, sudden violations, midnight complaints, an HOA board that always sided with Diane no matter what evidence anyone brought. I told myself we were different. I'd spent half my adult life proving people wrong who underestimated me. In basic training, in combat zones, in rooms where I was the only one who looked like me. I figured patience and paperwork would be enough here too. Still, I started keeping records. Every notice, every email, every odd interaction with Diane went into a folder on my laptop, dated and organized the way I'd been trained to document everything overseas. Denise called it overkill. I called it insurance. That June, the HOA held its annual meeting in the clubhouse. Diane ran it like a courtroom, gaveling down questions, cutting off anyone who challenged her numbers. When I asked about the association's rising dues, she simply said, "Landscaping costs went up," and moved to the next item. Nobody on the 7-person board ever contradicted her. Later I'd learn why. 3 members owed her personal favors. 2 were terrified of retaliation. And the last 2 simply agreed with everything she said. Rubber-stamping decisions nobody outside her circle ever saw in writing. I noticed her son, Tyler, 17, roaring around the neighborhood in a lifted truck well past the posted speed limit. Gravel spraying from our curb more than once. No citation ever appeared in his mailbox. The double standard sat there in plain sight, quiet and untouchable. One afternoon Diane cornered Denise at the mailbox kiosk. "I just want to make sure everyone understands our community standards," she said, eyes flicking toward our house. "Some people aren't used to how things work in neighborhoods like this." Denise didn't answer. She just walked inside. I asked Denise what neighborhoods like this was supposed to mean. She shrugged, jaw tight. "You know exactly what she meant," she said. "She just wants deniability if we ever repeat it." I wrote it down anyway, word for word, time-stamped in my folder. Despite it all, I loved our little house. Sunday mornings smelled like coffee and cut grass. Jaden practiced free throws in the driveway. Amara planted marigolds along the walkway. I refused to let one woman's cold stares poison the life we'd worked so hard to build. Then in late June, a new sign appeared at the entrance to Maple Ridge. Grilling restricted to rear patios only, violations subject to fine. No community vote. No mailed notice. And a date that happened to fall 3 days after our last cookout. I checked the HOA bylaws Denise and I had received at closing. Nothing in their restricted grilling location at all. Only grill placement near structures for safety. I photographed the page, photographed the new sign, and filed both away, a strange feeling settling in my stomach. At church that Sunday, an older woman named Miss Ruth pulled me aside. She'd lived in Maple Ridge for 11 years, one of the few black families before us. "Diane doesn't like being questioned," she warned. "And she really doesn't like people like us feeling too comfortable here." I thanked her for the warning but told her we weren't going anywhere. We'd paid for this house the same as everyone else. Worked the same hours. Mowed the same lawn. Whatever Diane was building toward, I intended to meet it standing still, not running. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday, taped to our front door instead of mailed like every other homeowner received theirs. Violation. Improper grill placement. Fine $150. It read, citing the new patio rule that had appeared without any vote or mailed ballot. I called the HOA office and told me, hesitant, that no formal vote had ever been logged for that rule change. She said she'd flag it for Diane, then hung up quickly, like she regretted saying anything at all. That weekend I drove around Maple Ridge with my phone camera, quietly photographing for other backyards with grills positioned exactly where mine sat, sometimes closer to the house than ours. None of them had received a single notice. I saved every photo, time-stamped and labeled. I brought the photos to the next HOA meeting, laid them on the table in front of the board. Diane barely glanced at them. "Those aren't relevant to your violation," she said flatly, and moved to close the discussion before anyone else could speak. A younger board member, Rachel Kim, finally spoke up. "Diane, if the rule applies to everyone, shouldn't it apply to everyone?" The room went quiet. Diane's smile tightened. "We'll look into it," she said, in a tone that made clear she never would. Walking out, "Mr. Alvarez caught my eye and gave a small, knowing nod, the kind that said he'd watched this exact scene play out before, with someone else, in some other year, ending the same disappointing way it always did around here. I paid the fine to avoid a lien, but I sent a certified letter disputing it in writing, attaching my photographs and requesting the meeting minutes where the patio rule was supposedly approved. 2 weeks later, the HOA office replied that records were unavailable at this time. Denise wanted to fight harder, file a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board. I hesitated. Taught me picking battles mattered as much as winning them, and I still hoped, foolishly maybe, that reason alone might change Diane's mind. Then the second notice came, this one for our garden. Unauthorized vegetable cultivation visible from the street. Fine $100. Amara's marigolds sat beside my tomato plants, the same kind of raised bed the Hendersons 3 houses down had kept for 6 years. Untouched. I photographed the Hendersons' garden too, side by side with mine, nearly identical in size and placement. I mailed both fines back with the comparison photos attached, requesting written clarification of the actual rule. No response came, only silence, thick and deliberate. At school pickup, another parent mentioned overhearing Diane at the salon complaining about certain new families lowering property values around here. Nobody used my name. Nobody had to. Embarrassed, later apologized to Denise privately, saying she wished she'd said something in the moment. Jaden came home from a friend's house one afternoon and asked, quietly, why some kids said our family was going to get kicked out soon. 10 years old, and already absorbing whispers meant for adults. I told him not to worry, though worry had already found its way home with him. I requested Maple Ridge's full financial records, standard practice any homeowner could ask for. Diane's assistant stalled for 3 weeks before finally sending incomplete spreadsheets, missing entire quarters of landscaping and maintenance expenses that supposedly justified our steadily rising HOA dues. A retired accountant 2 streets over, Mr. Patterson, offered to look over what records I did have. He frowned at the numbers almost immediately. These landscaping invoices are triple market rate, he said. Either your HOA is being robbed blind, or somebody's pocketing the difference. I filed that observation away too. Another thread in a tapestry I didn't yet understand. Whatever Diane was protecting went beyond one family's grill or garden. Money moved somewhere in these spreadsheets that nobody outside her small circle seemed allowed to trace. The fines kept coming, small and relentless, always timed for maximum sting. The week before Jaden's birthday party. The day before Amara's school recital. Never obvious enough to prove intent on paper, but obvious enough that Denise started calling it death by 1,000 notices. I began installing security cameras around our property. Partly for safety, partly because something told me documentation would matter more than arguments eventually. Denise thought I was being paranoid. 14 years of training told me otherwise. I mounted 4 cameras that covered every angle of our yard. One evening I caught, on camera, a car idling outside our house well past midnight. Headlights off. Someone photographing our front yard from the driver's seat. The plate matched a car registered to Diane's husband, Gary. I saved the footage, said nothing yet, and kept watching. At the next board meeting, I raised the financial discrepancies calmly, citing Mr. Patterson's estimate. Diane's face flushed for the first time since we'd met her. I don't appreciate being accused in front of the entire board, she said, voice tight, eyes narrowing at me directly. Rachel Kim, the young board member, asked to see the invoices herself. Diane promised to bring them next meeting. A promise she would find a dozen ways to postpone over the following months, always with some new excuse about auditors or missing paperwork. Driving home that night, I told Denise the fines weren't really about grills or gardens anymore, if they ever had been. Something bigger sat underneath all of it, and Diane Whitfield seemed determined to keep us too busy defending ourselves to ever find out what. By midsummer, the notices arrived almost weekly, each one citing a rule that seemed to shift shape depending on what we'd done that week. A wind chime was excessive noise. A birthday banner was unapproved signage. Denise started keeping her own folder, thicker than mine, within a month. I attended every board meeting I could. Calm, prepared, always with documentation in hand. Diane began scheduling meetings at odd times. Once at 7 in the morning, another time during a scheduled highway closure that made half the neighborhood late, including me. Deliberately, it seemed. A neighbor named Frank, normally friendly enough, started avoiding eye contact whenever I saw him at the mailbox. Denise learned through the school parent group that Diane had personally visited several houses, describing us as difficult and combative, poisoning the well before we'd even had a chance to defend ourselves. The unpaid balance from disputed fines crossed $400 by August. A letter arrived threatening a lien against our property. The same aggressive legal language Mr. Alvarez had once warned me about. I called a lawyer for the first time. A woman named Carla Jennings who worked HOA disputes. Carla reviewed our file and went quiet for a long moment. This pattern is textbook selective enforcement, she said. But proving intent in court takes time and money most families don't have. Keep documenting everything. If this escalates, we'll have exactly what we need. Diane recruited 2 more allies onto her side that month, replacing a retiring board member with her cousin, and convincing another neighbor, desperate for a variance on his own fence violation, to vote however she instructed in exchange for quietly dropping his fine. An anonymous complaint appeared in the HOA's online portal, claiming our dog barked excessively at all hours. We didn't own a dog. Next meeting, Diane simply said the complaint had been filed in error and moved on without apology. Jaden's friend stopped coming over after his mother, a board ally of Diane's, told him our house was under review by the association, whatever that meant to a 10-year-old. Jaden asked me if we were bad people. I held him and told him no. We absolutely were not. Amara stopped bringing marigolds inside after school. Afraid someone would photograph her again, like the day a stranger's phone had appeared over our fence line, capturing her kneeling in the garden. I found the footage on my own cameras and added it to Carla's growing file. Denise, usually unshakable, broke down crying in the kitchen one night after finding yet another notice on the door. This one for our children's chalk drawings on the driveway. When does it end? Marcus? She asked. I didn't have an answer that felt honest enough to give her. I requested a formal meeting with Diane alone, hoping some private conversation might cut through whatever performance she maintained in public. She agreed, then canceled twice, citing scheduling conflicts that somehow never applied to meetings where punishing us was on the agenda. When we finally met at the clubhouse, Diane sat across the table, hands folded, composed. I don't have anything against your family personally, she said. I just believe in maintaining standards. I asked why those standards seemed to apply only to our address. She didn't answer. I mentioned the financial discrepancies again, watching her expression carefully the way I'd learned to read faces under pressure overseas. Something flickered behind her eyes, quick and controlled, gone before most people would have caught it. Caught it. In exactly that look. Landscaping is expensive, she repeated. The same line from months earlier. Word for word. Rehearsed. I asked for an itemized breakdown. She promised one soon. A word that by now meant absolutely nothing coming from her mouth. And I knew it the moment she said it. That week, I drove past Diane's house and noticed new landscaping being installed. An elaborate stone fountain, fresh sod, decorative lighting, all far exceeding anything our modest dues should reasonably cover for one property alone, even accounting for common area maintenance costs. Mr. Still helping unofficially, cross-referenced public permit records with the HOA's landscaping contractor. The company, turned out, was owned by Diane's brother-in-law, invoicing the association at nearly triple standard rates for work performed across the neighborhood, including her own yard. I brought this to Carla, who grew visibly more interested. That's not just selective enforcement anymore, she said. That's potential embezzlement, if the numbers hold up under audit. We need bank statements, contractor invoices, board meeting minutes, everything you can legally obtain. Meanwhile, the personal fines against us continued, almost as if daring me to lose composure in public where witnesses could paint me as the aggressor instead of Diane. I refused to give her that satisfaction, no matter how many nights I lay awake replaying every interaction. At Jaden's school, a teacher mentioned overhearing another parent, a Whitfield ally, say our family would probably be gone by fall. I asked the teacher directly what she meant. She looked uncomfortable and admitted several parents believed Diane intended to force us out through relentless fines. I began sleeping less, running scenarios in my head like old mission briefings, mapping every possible move Diane might make next. Denise noticed the toll it took and finally said what I already knew. This isn't just about grills or gardens for her. This is personal. Marcus, I agreed, though understanding why still eluded me. Some people simply couldn't stand seeing a family who looked like ours living comfortably, unapologetically, in a neighborhood they'd quietly decided belonged to a certain kind of person. It wasn't new. Rachel Kim, increasingly uneasy with what she was witnessing, began quietly photographing board documents before Diane could misplace them. She texted me one evening, unprompted, "I don't like what I'm seeing here. Keep everything you have." Many of us realize. I thanked her, careful not to push too hard, aware that any perceived pressure from me could be twisted into another narrative about aggression. Patience. Again. I'd built an entire career on outlasting people who underestimated how long I could wait for the right moment. Diane escalated the lien threat to a formal filing that September, citing our unpaid disputed fines, now totaling $600. Carla filed a counter-response within the week, citing lack of documented rule adoption and selective enforcement, buying us critical time before any lien could attach. The neighborhood grew visibly tense that fall. Some neighbors avoided us entirely, afraid of Diane's influence. Others, quietly, started leaving supportive notes in our mailbox, and signed, "Small acts of courage from people too frightened to say anything openly against the woman who controlled their community." One note simply read, "We see what she's doing. Keep fighting." I showed it to Denise, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled, really smiled, reminded that whatever Diane wanted us to believe, we weren't as alone in Maple Ridge as it sometimes felt. Miss Ruth from church stopped by one Sunday with a casserole and a warning. She tried something similar with the Coopers back in 2016, she said. Drove them out within 8 months. Don't let her rush you the way she rushed them. Take your time. I asked what happened to the Coopers afterward. Miss Ruth shook her head. Moved 2 counties over. Never came back for so much as a visit. Diane made sure of that. Her voice carried the particular weight of someone who'd watched it happen and stayed silent too long. That story lit something in me I hadn't quite let myself feel until then. Somewhere between anger and resolve. Whatever happened to the Coopers wasn't going to happen to us. Not without a fight documented so thoroughly that no board, no court, could look away from it. I called Carla that night and told her I wanted everything on record moving forward. Every meeting recorded with consent where legal. Every notice photographed within minutes. Every strange car outside our house logged with timestamps. She agreed. Patience, she said.
You clearly have plenty.
Denise and I sat the kids down that weekend, careful with our words, and told them some grown-ups in the neighborhood were being unfair to our family, but that we were handling it the right way, calmly, honestly, and that no fine or ugly rumor would ever change who we were. Strangely, October brought a lull. The notices slowed to almost nothing. Diane, perhaps sensing Rachel Kim's growing scrutiny, seemed to pull back, focusing instead on landscaping committee business and holiday decoration guidelines that, for once, applied evenly to every house on the block. Jaden's friend came back around, embarrassed but apologetic, admitting his mother had overreacted to gossip that turned out to be baseless. Amara brought her marigolds back onto the porch, no longer hiding them, and for a few weeks our house felt almost entirely ordinary again. Denise and I allowed ourselves to breathe. We hosted a small dinner for the Chens and the Alvarez family. Nothing extravagant, just gratitude for neighbors who'd shown quiet kindness through a difficult stretch. Diane wasn't invited, and for once, nobody seemed to mind that at all. Carla continued gathering documents in the background, methodical and unhurried, treating the calm as an opportunity rather than a resolution. People like Diane don't stop, she reminded me over coffee one afternoon. They regroup. Because it won't last. I took her advice seriously, using the quiet weeks to organize 18 months of notices, photographs, emails, and video timestamps into a single, chronological file, the kind of clean record any investigator or judge could follow without needing me to explain a single detail aloud. Mr. His informal audit of publicly available HOA spending records, concluding that at minimum $200,000 in landscaping costs over 5 years couldn't be reasonably explained by any legitimate contract rate he could find for comparable neighborhoods nearby. Rachel Kim resigned quietly from a landscaping subcommittee Diane chaired, citing scheduling conflicts, though she privately told me it was because she'd seen invoice amendments made after board approval. Numbers changed in ways that only benefited one specific contractor consistently across multiple years. I asked Rachel if she'd testify to any of this someday. If it came to that. She hesitated, clearly weighing personal risk, then nodded slowly. If it comes to that, and it's done right, yes. I didn't sign up for this to protect someone stealing from all of us. Thanksgiving came and went peacefully. Diane sent a generic community newsletter wishing everyone a happy holiday season. No mention of grills, gardens, or fines. Denise joked it almost felt like living in a normal neighborhood again. The kind we'd actually pictured when we signed our closing papers. I should have known better than to relax completely. 14 years of deployments taught me that the quietest stretches often meant something significant was being planned just out of sight. Not that the danger had passed, only that it had changed shape temporarily. In December, Diane hosted an elaborate holiday party at the clubhouse, and for the first time, our family received an invitation, mailed properly, no strange timing, no odd exclusions. Denise wondered aloud if perhaps something had genuinely shifted in how Diane viewed our presence here. We attended, cautiously optimistic. Diane greeted us warmly at the door, complimented Amara's dress, asked Jaden about his basketball season. Felt almost surreal, watching her play the perfect neighborhood hostess after everything we documented quietly for months on end. Walking home that night, Denise squeezed my hand and said maybe, just maybe, we turned some invisible corner. I wanted to believe her. The part trained never to lower its guard completely, simply filed the pleasant evening away as one more data point, nothing more. January brought an email blast to every Maple Ridge homeowner announcing a special bylaw amendment vote regarding outdoor cooking equipment, scheduled with only 48 hours notice. During a weekday afternoon when most residents, including us, were still at work, I requested a proxy vote by mail, standard procedure under the HOA's own governing documents. The office claimed proxy forms had run out and couldn't be reprinted in time, a convenient excuse that ensured only Diane's small, loyal cluster of attendees would actually vote. The amendment passed unanimously among the dozen people present, banning smoke-producing cooking devices visible from adjacent properties. Language so broad it effectively outlawed any backyard grill in the entire neighborhood, except somehow, enforcement would apply selectively once again. Rachel Kim texted me furious that night. She scheduled it when she knew you'd be at work. This wasn't a vote, Marcus. This was theater. She'd voted no, one of only 2 dissenting voices in a room stacked entirely in Diane's favor from the start. Within a week, we received a $2,000 fine, the largest yet, citing repeated violations of the new grilling amendment. Carla filed an immediate legal challenge, arguing the vote violated the HOA's own quorum requirements and notice periods under state homeowners association law. While researching case law, Carla discovered something unexpected. 3 of the 12 signatures on the amendment's attendance sheet belonged to homeowners who swore, under written affidavit, they'd never attended any such meeting. Diane, it appeared, had simply added names to make quorum. I brought this evidence to Rachel, who went pale reading it. "That's forgery," she said quietly. "Actual forgery, not just aggressive enforcement." She agreed to provide a sworn statement herself, confirming the meeting's real attendance count fell well short of the number officially recorded. Mr. Formal audit deepened further when he cross-referenced the forged attendance sheet against bank withdrawal patterns, noticing unusually large cash withdrawals from the HOA account clustered suspiciously close to landscaping emergency repair invoices that lacked any accompanying itemized work order. Denise, exhausted by the constant pressure, suggested selling the house and starting over somewhere Diane's reach didn't extend. I understood the temptation completely, but something in me refused to hand a woman like her another quiet victory added to whatever tally she kept of families driven out. That February, our neighbor Mr. Alvarez confided he'd recorded, almost accidentally, a conversation at the mailbox where Diane referred to our family using language that made clear her objections had never truly been about grills, gardens, or bylaws at all, but about something far uglier underneath. He hesitated to share the recording, worried about retaliation against his own family, but eventually agreed to preserve it with Carla under attorney-client privilege, to be used only if absolutely necessary, protecting him while ensuring the truth existed somewhere safe and undeniable. Carla reviewed the recording and grew unusually quiet afterward. "This changes the entire legal posture," she said. "Selective enforcement is one thing. Documented discriminatory intent from the association's own president is something courts, and honestly, the entire community, take far more seriously." I told Denise about the recording that night. She sat silent for a long moment, then asked simply, "Does it feel like justice, or does it just feel exhausting?" "Both," I admitted. "Some victories arrive heavier than the fights that earned them, and this felt like one of those." Diane's confidence, meanwhile, seemed to grow rather than shrink. She began appearing at neighborhood events with an air of untouchability, laughing louder, standing taller, as though 9 years without meaningful consequence had convinced her nothing could ever truly reach someone in her position. Her son Tyler, emboldened perhaps by his mother's example, keyed a scratch along my truck door in the school parking lot, caught clearly on a nearby camera Carla later subpoenaed. Diane dismissed the incident as typical teenage stuff when the school principal called her about it. I filed a police report anyway, calm and thorough, adding it to the growing file Carla managed. The responding officer that day, a young patrolman named Diaz, seemed genuinely troubled reviewing the footage, noting privately that this wasn't the first complaint his department had logged involving Tyler. March brought another forged document, this time a supposed unanimous board resolution authorizing immediate lien filing against our property for accumulated fines now exceeding $3,000. Rachel confirmed, under oath to Carla, that no such board meeting had actually occurred that month at all. Carla filed an emergency injunction, presenting the forged attendance sheets, Rachel's sworn statement, Mr. Patterson's financial analysis, and Mr. Alvarez's recording as supporting evidence, requesting the court freeze any lien action while the underlying HOA governance violations underwent formal review. The judge granted a temporary restraining order against the lien, a small but significant victory. Diane, informed of the ruling by her own attorney, reportedly threw a stack of papers across her kitchen table hard enough that Gary, her husband, mentioned it to a neighbor the next morning. Word of the injunction spread quickly through Maple Ridge's group chat, careful and coded at first, then increasingly open as more residents realized the woman they'd feared for nearly a decade might finally be facing something she couldn't simply outshout or outfine into submission. 2 other families, the Osei family and an elderly widow named Mrs. Callahan, reached out privately, describing eerily similar patterns of selective fines, mysterious anonymous complaints, and financial questions about landscaping contracts that never quite added up when anyone bothered to ask for details. I connected both families with Carla, who began building what she now called a pattern of conduct case rather than a single dispute, arguing Diane's entire 9-year presidency reflected a documented practice of discriminatory enforcement paired with likely financial misconduct across multiple budget cycles. Diane, sensing the walls closing in slightly, called an emergency board meeting of her own, attempting to push through a resolution stripping homeowners' rights to request financial records for security reasons. Language so transparent even her closest allies hesitated visibly before voting. Rachel voted no publicly this time, no longer willing to protect appearances. If there's nothing to hide, there's no reason to hide it, she said, loud enough for the recorded minutes to capture clearly. Diane's face reddened, though she pushed the resolution through regardless. 3 votes to 2. I attended that meeting in person, calm as always, and asked directly whether the resolution applied retroactively to already pending requests, specifically mine. Diane snapped that all pending requests would be reviewed under new procedures, a stalling tactic transparent enough that even her allies exchanged uncomfortable glances. Outside afterward, Mrs. Callahan approached me, visibly shaken but resolute. I've lived here 19 years, she said. I've never seen anyone stand up to her the way you have. Whatever happens, thank you for finally making the rest of us feel brave enough to speak. That encouragement mattered more than she probably realized. 14 years in the Army taught me morale could shift an entire unit's fate. And watching neighbors slowly find their voices against someone who'd controlled the narrative for nearly a decade felt like something worth every sleepless night it cost me. April brought a new low, an anonymous letter mailed to my employer, the high school, alleging I'd harassed a neighbor and questioning my fitness to work with students. The principal, thankfully, recognized the letter's vague, and signed nature immediately and dismissed it without hesitation, informing me out of courtesy. I traced the letter's postmark to a zip code matching Diane's own neighborhood post office, a detail Carla flagged immediately as another potential piece of evidence, though not definitive proof on its own. One more thread woven into an increasingly undeniable pattern. Denise, initially hesitant about escalating things publicly, changed her mind after the letter arrived at my workplace. She went after your job now, Marcus, she said, jaw set. This isn't just about our house anymore. This is about making sure she can never do this to anyone else. We agreed together to compile everything. Carla's legal file, Mr. Patterson's financial analysis, Rachel's testimony, Mr. Alvarez's recording, the forged documents, into a single comprehensive report, ready to present formally to the state's HOA Oversight Board and, if necessary, local law enforcement. Carla cautioned patience once more. Everything you have is powerful, she said. But timing matters. Present it too early, and she has time to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We need one clean, undeniable moment where everything comes together publicly, with no room for her to spin it. I trusted her judgment. Though waiting grew harder by the week as Diane's aggression toward our family only intensified, almost daring us to react rashly in public where she could reframe herself, once again, as the reasonable party facing an unreasonable, combative neighbor. In May, our security cameras caught Gary, Diane's husband, parked outside our house past midnight again, this time photographing our garage door and truck for reasons neither of us could explain. I reported it to police as suspicious behavior, adding the footage to Carla's file without confrontation. Officer Diaz, now familiar with our family's growing case file, personally reviewed the footage and mentioned, off the record, that Diane's household had generated an unusual number of complaints and reports over the years, though nothing had ever formally stuck due to lack of coordinated evidence. Until now, word spread that summer that Diane intended to host an elaborate 4th of July community celebration at the clubhouse. Partly, longtime residents whispered, to reassert her image as the neighborhood's beloved leader before whatever quiet investigation swirling around her could gain any further momentum. Rachel warned me privately that Diane seemed increasingly erratic behind closed doors, snapping at board members over minor issues, obsessing over optics for the 4th of July event, as though she sensed, on some instinctive level, that her control over Maple Ridge had begun slipping through her fingers. Mr. A more formal financial summary that June, estimating nearly $240,000 in questionable landscaping and emergency repair expenses across 5 years, funneled largely through Diane's brother-in-law's company at rates no reasonable market comparison could ever justify. Carla submitted this financial summary quietly to the county district attorney's office for preliminary review, alongside Rachel's sworn statement and the forged attendance records, careful to keep the filing confidential while the 4th of July event, and whatever Diane might attempt there, still loomed ahead unpredictably. I felt something shift in myself around this time. Less anger now, more resolve. The particular calm I remembered from missions where preparation finally outweighed fear. Whatever Diane planned next, I intended to meet it not with rage, but with the same steady patience that had gotten me this far. Denise noticed the change too. "You're not scared of her anymore," she said one evening, watching me review camera footage calmly at the kitchen table. "I don't think I ever was," I told her. Honestly, I was scared of what she could do to us before we had proof. The Osei family reached out again, sharing that their own teenage son had recently been stopped and questioned by a private security patrol Diane had personally hired, patrolling only certain streets, specifically the ones where minority families happen to live, a detail too consistent to be coincidental any longer. Carla added this to the pattern of conduct file, now substantial enough that she quietly requested, and received, A preliminary meeting with an investigator from the state's Fair Housing Enforcement Division, someone experienced specifically in HOA discrimination cases involving selective enforcement and financial misconduct combined. Mrs. Meanwhile, discovered her own late husband's original HOA membership documents in a forgotten filing cabinet, revealing an amendment history that didn't match anything Diane had presented publicly for years, suggesting the bylaws themselves had been quietly altered multiple times without proper homeowner votes. Every new discovery added weight to what Carla now called an airtight case, though she still counseled patience, waiting for the right undeniable moment, ideally public, ideally impossible for Diane to spin, reframe, or bury under legal delays the way she'd buried every complaint before ours. I sensed that moment approaching without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Diane's 4th of July celebration loomed 2 weeks away, and something in the air around Maple Ridge felt charged, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see who would finally break first. Denise and I decided we would attend the 4th of July event as a family. Calm, present, unafraid, refusing to give Diane the satisfaction of watching us hide. Whatever she was planning behind her tightening smile, we intended to face it standing exactly where we'd always stood. The 4th of July arrived warm and bright, Maple Ridge decorated in red, white, and blue bunting, the clubhouse lawn crowded with families, folding chairs, and the smell of charcoal smoke drifting from a dozen grills set up under Diane's own supervision for the community celebration. Ironically, Diane had personally approved grills for this one event, an obvious double standard nobody in the crowd seemed willing to point out loudly, though I noticed more than a few knowing glances exchanged among neighbors who'd received their own quiet fines over the exact same equipment. I manned our family's designated grill station near the edge of the lawn, tongs in hand, chatting easily with Mr. Alvarez and the Chens, trying simply to enjoy an ordinary holiday afternoon despite the tension I could feel radiating from Diane's direction whenever our eyes happened to meet. Around 3 o'clock, Tyler, Diane's son, wandered near our grill station with 2 friends, laughing loudly, deliberately bumping the folding table hard enough to nearly topple our cooler. I steadied it calmly, said nothing provocative, simply asked the boys to be more careful around the hot equipment. Tyler's face flushed with anger at being corrected in front of his friends. He said something under his breath I didn't fully catch, then stormed off toward his mother, who stood watching from near the clubhouse entrance, her expression sharpening the moment she saw her son's reaction. 10 minutes later, Diane approached our grill station directly, voice raised loud enough for nearby families to turn and look. "You threatened my son with that grill fork?" she announced, pointing dramatically. "Everyone here just watched you brandish a weapon at a minor. I'm calling the police right now." I stood there stunned for a moment, tongs still in hand, exactly as I'd been holding them the entire afternoon. Denise stepped forward immediately. "That never happened," she said firmly. Marcus asked the boys to step back from hot equipment. Nothing more. Missed the entire thing. Diane ignored her completely, already dialing 911 with theatrical urgency, describing to the dispatcher an armed confrontation that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the calm, ordinary interaction dozens of families standing nearby had actually just witnessed with their own eyes moments earlier. A crowd gathered quickly, phones rising into the air, recording from every angle. "Mr. Beside me immediately," We all saw what happened. Marcus, he said loud enough for others to hear. This isn't going to work the way she thinks it's going to work. Rachel Kim, present at the celebration, pulled out her own phone and began recording Diane's escalating call to police, capturing every exaggerated word for the record. Her expression a mixture of disbelief and grim determination that this moment, finally, might be the one Carla had been waiting for. Diane, apparently unaware how many phones were now trained on her, continued embellishing details to the dispatcher, claiming I'd lunged toward Tyler, that children were terrified, painting a scene increasingly detached from the actual, unremarkable interaction that had genuinely taken place near our grill station. I kept flipping burgers, deliberately calm, refusing to give her the reactive outburst she seemed desperate to provoke on camera. Denise squeezed my arm gently. "Stay steady," she whispered. "Everyone here already knows the truth. Let her keep talking." Within minutes, sirens sounded in the distance, growing steadily louder. The celebration's cheerful atmosphere shifted instantly into something tense and uncertain. Dozens of neighbors falling quiet, watching, waiting, phones still raised. The entire block suddenly aware something significant was unfolding in real time before them. Diane straightened her posture as the patrol cars turned into the clubhouse parking lot, smoothing her blouse, adopting the composed expression of someone confident she'd already won, exactly as she had every single time before across 9 untouchable years running this neighborhood however she pleased. I noticed Gary, her husband, standing off to the side, phone pressed to his ear, speaking urgently to someone, his expression tight with something that looked less like support and more like genuine alarm at whatever escalating situation his wife had just set irreversibly into motion. 2 patrol cars parked, and 4 officers stepped out, scanning the crowd professionally, assessing the scene before approaching. Diane moved toward them immediately, already speaking, gesturing dramatically toward me and the grill station as though presenting an open and shut case requiring immediate, forceful action. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, listened patiently to Diane's account, glancing occasionally toward me and the crowd of neighbors, his expression professionally neutral but clearly attentive to the dozens of witnesses murmuring quietly among themselves nearby, phones still recording everything. Then a second officer stepped out of the passenger side, younger, sharper-eyed, and froze mid-stride the moment he saw my face clearly across the lawn. His posture changed instantly, shoulders squaring, something unmistakable crossing his expression that had nothing to do with Diane's accusations at all. I recognized him almost simultaneously, though it took a beat for the memory to fully surface beneath years of distance. Corporal Ray Ramirez, 19 years old the last time I'd seen him, pulled unconscious from a burning vehicle outside Kandahar while I dragged him 50 yards under fire. "Sergeant Webb?" he said, voice cracking slightly with disbelief, already moving toward me instead of toward whatever scene Diane had described. The crowd fell silent, sensing immediately that something unexpected, something significant, had just interrupted the confrontation everyone had gathered to witness moments earlier. Diane blinked, visibly thrown off script for the first time all afternoon. "Officer, this is the man who threatened my son," she said quickly, trying to redirect attention back toward her narrative before it slipped entirely out of her control in front of the watching crowd. Officer Ramirez ignored her completely, closing the distance and extending his hand toward mine. Then, without hesitation, snapping into a formal salute in front of the entire gathered neighborhood. "You saved my life, sir," he said, voice thick with emotion.
"I never got the chance."
The crowd's stunned silence broke into a wave of murmurs, phones capturing every second, as the lead officer turned toward Diane with a noticeably different expression now. One considerably more skeptical than the professional neutrality he'd maintained just moments earlier before this unexpected turn. "Ma'am," the lead officer said carefully, "you're telling me this man threatened your son with a weapon?" Diane hesitated, glancing nervously at the dozens of phones recording her, at Officer Ramirez still standing at attention beside me, at the crowd's rapidly shifting mood surrounding her entirely. "That's what I saw," she insisted, though her voice had lost its earlier theatrical certainty, wavering slightly under the weight of so many watching eyes and the sudden, undeniable presence of a decorated officer publicly honoring the very man she'd just accused of violent intent. Rachel Kim stepped forward, phone still recording, and calmly stated she'd witnessed the entire interaction between me and Tyler firsthand, describing exactly what had actually occurred. Nothing resembling Diane's account whatsoever. Her testimony corroborated immediately by Mr. Alvarez and 3 other nearby families. The lead officer requested to review any footage available, and within minutes, several neighbors, myself included, offered their own recordings from personal cameras and phones, all showing the same unremarkable, entirely non-threatening interaction. Diane had transformed into an armed confrontation for the responding dispatcher. Officer Ramirez, still visibly emotional, quietly mentioned to his partner that he personally trusted my account completely, given everything he knew about my character from 14 years of service together. A statement that carried considerable weight among officers already growing skeptical of Diane's unraveling story. Diane's composure finally cracked visibly, her voice rising defensively. "This is ridiculous. You're taking his word because of some military connection. That doesn't change what actually happened here today," she insisted, though her words now sounded increasingly desperate against the mounting, contradicting evidence surrounding her. The lead officer, reviewing footage on a neighbor's phone, paused the video and looked up at Diane directly. "Ma'am, this footage clearly shows no threatening gesture whatsoever. I'm going to need you to explain the discrepancy between what you reported and what actually happened here." Sensing the situation spiraling entirely beyond her control, Diane attempted one final gambit, claiming Tyler had been traumatized regardless of what the footage showed, demanding the officers at minimum issue some formal warning against me to preserve some semblance of the outcome she'd originally intended. The officers declined, informing her instead that filing a false police report carried serious legal consequences, and that given the clear video evidence contradicting her emergency call, further investigation into the incident, and possibly her conduct specifically, would now be necessary moving forward. Word of what had just happened rippled through the crowd instantly, neighbors turning toward each other in stunned disbelief, murmuring, some laughing in shocked relief, others simply staring at Diane with expressions that suggested years of quiet fear finally cracking open into something else entirely. Carla, whom Rachel had quietly called the moment the confrontation began, arrived just as the officers finished documenting statements from witnesses, immediately requesting copies of the police report and offering the district attorney's office details regarding the ongoing financial and discrimination investigation already underway. The lead officer, learning of the broader pending investigation from Carla, exchanged a meaningful glance with his partner before informing Diane that additional detectives would likely be in contact soon regarding matters entirely separate from today's false report. Matters she clearly hadn't anticipated surfacing so suddenly. Diane stood frozen at the center of the clubhouse lawn, surrounded by neighbors who no longer looked away from her. Cameras still recording. Officer Ramirez still standing near me. And for the first time in 9 years, the untouchable queen of Maple Ridge looked unmistakably afraid. The lead officer asked Diane to step aside while his partner took formal statements from witnesses. One by one, each account matching the footage almost exactly. No threat, no weapon, only a father asking 2 teenagers to step back from a hot grill. Tyler stood frozen near the clubhouse entrance, phone still in hand, having filmed his own version of events earlier, expecting it to support his mother's story. Instead, his footage showed clearly that nothing resembling a threat had ever taken place near our grill station that afternoon. An officer asked to see Tyler's video directly, and he handed his phone over without argument, avoiding his mother's eyes entirely. The footage, ironically recorded by her own son, became one more piece of evidence confirming Diane's emergency call had been entirely fabricated from nothing. Diane attempted once more to argue that Tyler had felt threatened emotionally, even without physical evidence, but the lead officer cut her off firmly. "Ma'am, feeling uncomfortable isn't a crime. Filing a false emergency report describing an armed threat that never happened absolutely is." Neighbors who had spent years too frightened to speak openly against Diane suddenly found their voices all at once, several stepping forward to describe their own finds, their own strange late-night visitors, their own quiet fear of ever challenging the woman who'd controlled Maple Ridge for nearly a decade. Mrs. watching from her folding chair, called out that Diane had fined her twice for unauthorized wind chimes, the same summer Diane installed her own elaborate fountain without ever submitting a single permit request through the association's supposedly strict architectural review process. The lead officer, now visibly reassessing the entire situation, informed Diane she would need to accompany them to provide a formal statement regarding the false report. Standard procedure, he explained, whenever video evidence directly contradicted an emergency caller's account of events. Diane's voice rose in protest as an officer gently guided her toward the patrol car, insisting this was harassment, that she was the victim here. Words that landed strangely hollow against a backdrop of dozens of neighbors who had just watched her manufacture an entire false emergency in real time. Gary hurried over, phone still pressed against his ear, disconnecting his call abruptly to intercept the officers. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, visibly embarrassed by the growing crowd of neighbors recording everything unfolding around his wife with their phones held steady and unblinking. The officer explained calmly that filing a false report was a serious matter regardless of who the caller happened to be, and that cooperation now would go considerably further than continued protest in front of an audience this large and this thoroughly documented. Denise wrapped an arm around Jaden and Amara, both wide-eyed watching the scene unfold, and quietly explained that sometimes telling the truth, even when it's hard, matters more than anything else, especially when so many people are finally brave enough to tell it together. Rachel Kim approached me afterward, still visibly shaken but resolute. "I've wanted to say something for years," she admitted. I just never had enough evidence. Or honestly, enough courage. Until watching your family refuse to back down finally showed me what standing firm actually looks like. Officer Ramirez lingered a while longer after his partner finished processing statements, shaking my hand once more before leaving. I owe you my life, Sergeant, he said quietly. Today, I just got to return a fraction of that favor. I'm glad it mattered when it counted most. As the crowd slowly dispersed that evening, Mr. Alvarez clapped my shoulder warmly. 9 years, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. 9 years we all watched her do this, and it took one family who refused to back down to finally make everyone else brave enough to speak up too. I stood there a long moment after everyone left. Grill still warm, tongs still in hand, watching the empty clubhouse lawn where an entire neighborhood's quiet fear had finally cracked open into something resembling justice. However overdue, however exhausting the 18 months required to reach it had been. In the days following the 4th of July, video of Diane's false 911 call spread through Maple Ridge's group chats faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. Neighbors sharing clip after clip, finally speaking openly about years of fines, threats, and quiet intimidation they'd endured in silence. The county investigator Carla had been working with formally opened a case, combining the false police report with the growing financial misconduct file, the forged attendance sheets, Rachel's testimony, and Mr. Patterson's audit into one comprehensive investigation into Diane's entire 9-year presidency. Detectives visited the HOA office within the week. Seizing financial records the office could no longer claim were simply unavailable, cross-referencing bank statements against Mr. Patterson's estimates and confirming nearly $240,000 funneled through inflated landscaping contracts tied to Diane's own family. Diane's husband Gary, questioned separately, reportedly grew defensive when detectives asked about the brother-in-law's landscaping company, unaware apparently of the full scope of what his wife had authorized over the years, and the marriage, according to neighbors who knew them, grew visibly strained almost overnight. Rachel Kim submitted her formal statement to the county, along with photographs of altered board documents she'd secretly preserved, confirming under oath that multiple votes, including the grilling amendment and the lien resolution against our family, had never actually reached legitimate quorum requirements. The Osei family and Mrs. Callahan both submitted formal statements as well, describing their own experiences with selective fines and the mysterious private security patrols targeting specific streets, corroborating a documented pattern that stretched back years before our family had ever even moved into Maple Ridge. Within 3 weeks, the county prosecutor's office filed charges against Diane for filing a false police report, and separately, for embezzlement related to the inflated landscaping contracts, charges that carried the possibility of real prison time depending on how the financial investigation ultimately concluded. News of the charges spread beyond Maple Ridge entirely when a local reporter, tipped off by an anonymous resident, ran a story about an HOA president accused of both discriminatory harassment and financial fraud, quoting Officer Ramirez's public salute as the moment everything had finally started unraveling. The story went further than any of us expected, picked up by a regional news station, then briefly by national outlets covering community and civil rights stories, transforming what had felt like an intensely personal, exhausting fight into something the wider public suddenly recognized and cared about. Reporters requested interviews, and after careful consideration with Carla, Denise and I agreed to speak briefly, calm and measured, emphasizing not anger but the simple, documented truth of what our family had endured, and the importance of standing firm even when justice moved slower than patience could bear. Officer Ramirez, interviewed separately, spoke openly about the day I'd pulled him from a burning vehicle overseas, explaining that recognizing me at that clubhouse hadn't been coincidence exactly, but the kind of quiet, persistent gratitude that stays with a person for the rest of their life. Maple Ridge's remaining board members, facing mounting public pressure and the county's active investigation, voted unanimously to remove Diane from the HOA presidency immediately, appointing Rachel Kim as interim president pending a full community election scheduled for later that year. Diane, informed of her removal by certified letter delivered to her own front door, reportedly refused to answer, though neighbors watched her curtains shift as the delivery driver walked away. The same quiet, watchful posture she'd once used to monitor every house on the street except her own. Tyler, questioned separately by school administrators after the truck scratching footage resurfaced alongside broader community scrutiny, faced disciplinary action at school, and according to former friends, distanced himself increasingly from his mother, embarrassed by the public unraveling of everything she'd built her identity around. Gary filed for divorce that autumn, citing irreconcilable differences, though several neighbors speculated privately that discovering the true scope of his wife's financial misconduct, hidden even from him for years, had finally broken whatever loyalty had kept their marriage intact through everything else. The county's financial investigation concluded that winter, confirming Mr. Patterson's estimates almost exactly, and Diane pleaded guilty to reduced embezzlement charges. In exchange for restitution, avoiding trial but accepting a felony conviction, probation, and a court order barring her from ever holding an HOA leadership position again. The false police report charge proceeded separately, and Diane received a suspended sentence alongside mandatory community service. A judge noting during sentencing that the video evidence from that 4th of July afternoon left absolutely no room for reasonable doubt about what had actually occurred. Restitution funds slowly began returning to the Maple Ridge HOA's account, allowing Rachel's interim board to finally address years of neglected maintenance. The inflated landscaping contracts had never actually funded properly. Repaving the cul-de-sac and repairing the clubhouse roof residents had complained about for years. Under Rachel's leadership, the board formally reviewed and reversed every disputed fine issued against our family, refunding the money we'd paid and issuing a written apology on behalf of the association, an unprecedented gesture nobody in Maple Ridge could recall happening under Diane's entire tenure. Miss Ruth from church cried happy tears when she heard the news, telling Denise it was the first time in her 19 years living there that she'd actually seen the HOA hold someone accountable instead of simply protecting whoever happened to hold power at the time. The Osei family and Mrs. Callahan received similar reversals and apologies. And slowly, cautiously, more residents began speaking openly about years of quiet intimidation they'd endured, grateful finally to live somewhere that didn't require constant vigilance against an HOA president wielding fines like personal weapons. Jaden's friend's mother, the one who'd once spread rumors about our family getting kicked out, apologized privately to Denise at a school function, admitting she'd simply repeated whatever Diane told her without ever questioning it. A small but meaningful reckoning playing out across the entire neighborhood. Amara returned her marigolds proudly to the front porch where they belonged, no longer worried about strangers photographing her over the fence. And Jaden's basketball games once again filled our weekends with nothing more complicated than ordinary. Welcome distraction from anything resembling controversy. Officer Ramirez visited occasionally afterward. Not in uniform, just as a friend. Sharing dinner with our family on a few quiet evenings. Grateful for a second chance at a relationship interrupted years earlier by deployment orders and the simple, brutal randomness of who survives and who doesn't overseas. Rachel Kim, elected formally as HOA president that following spring, implemented transparent financial reporting and an independent audit committee, ensuring no single person could ever again control Maple Ridge's rules, budget, and enforcement decisions without meaningful oversight from the broader community. Carla's firm used our case, with permission, as a training example for other HOA discrimination disputes, hoping the documented pattern, from selective fines to forged votes to the eventual financial fraud discovery, might help other families recognize warning signs earlier than we had. Denise and I planted a small oak tree in our backyard that spring. Nothing symbolic intended at first. Just something for the kids to watch grow over the years. Though it felt, quietly, like exactly the kind of permanence Diane had once tried so hard to deny us. Looking back over 18 months of notices, recordings, sworn statements, and one unforgettable 4th of July afternoon, I realized patience hadn't simply been a virtue we'd clung to out of necessity. It had been the entire strategy, the only weapon capable of outlasting someone who counted on us breaking first. Maple Ridge today looks almost exactly like the neighborhood Denise and I first pictured when we signed our closing papers years ago. Quiet, welcoming, occasionally imperfect, but finally, genuinely fair, in ways it simply hadn't been before one family refused to let injustice go undocumented and unanswered. Diane Whitfield still lives 2 streets over. Though neighbors say she rarely leaves her house these days, her name mentioned mostly in stories parents tell their kids about fairness, accountability, and what happens eventually to people who mistake temporary power for permanent immunity from consequence. Sometimes Jaden asks what really changed everything that day at the 4th of July celebration. I tell him honestly it wasn't the salute, though that moment still gives me chills remembering it, but simply years of quiet, steady documentation finally meeting a moment too public for anyone to ignore. Denise says the real victory wasn't Diane's conviction at all, but watching our children grow up understanding that dignity doesn't require permission from anyone, that fairness is worth defending patiently, and that sometimes the calmest person in the room ends up holding all the power in the end. I think about Corporal Ramirez often. How a single moment overseas years earlier rippled forward unexpectedly into the exact afternoon our family needed it most. A reminder that the good we do rarely disappears completely, even when we've long since stopped expecting anything back from it. Maple Ridge held its first fully transparent HOA meeting under Rachel's presidency that following autumn. Financial records posted publicly. Enforcement policies applied evenly across every address. And for the first time since we'd moved in, nobody left that clubhouse afraid of what selective punishment might arrive next. Our family still grills every Saturday. Smoke curling up exactly as it always had. Kids laughing. Neighbors waving from their porches. Except now the only thing anyone calls over about our cookouts is a friendly request for extra corn on the cob. Detectives executing a search warrant on Diane's home that August discovered a second handwritten ledger hidden in a garage filing cabinet. tracking cash payments from the inflated landscaping contracts that never appeared anywhere in the HOA's official digital records at all. The handwritten ledger, cross-referenced against her brother-in-law's bank deposits, confirmed prosecutors' worst suspicions. Nearly $90,000 of the embezzled funds had gone directly into a private account under Diane's maiden name. Money she'd apparently been quietly diverting for personal use for years. This discovery alone added additional felony counts to her pending charges. And her defense attorney, according to courthouse gossip, reportedly urged her repeatedly to accept a plea deal rather than risk a jury seeing the full, damning scope of premeditated financial deception laid out in her own handwriting. The regional news station ran a longer follow-up piece that fall, interviewing Rachel Kim, Mr. Patterson, and briefly Officer Ramirez again, weaving together the full arc from selective fines to forged votes to false police report to embezzlement. A story local viewers found impossible to look away from. A statewide fair housing advocacy group reached out afterward, inviting Denise and me to speak at a community forum about recognizing early warning signs of discriminatory HOA enforcement, a request we accepted cautiously, hoping our exhausting 18 months might spare some other family a similarly long fight. At that forum, 3 separate families from different towns approached us afterward, describing eerily familiar patterns from their own HOA experiences: selective fines, mysterious anonymous complaints, financial records that never quite added up. Confirming what Carla had suspected all along, Diane's playbook wasn't unique to her alone. Carla began compiling these patterns into a broader resource guide for homeowners, distributed through the Fair Housing Organization, outlining exactly the kind of documentation, timestamps, photographs, recorded meetings, that had ultimately made our own case impossible for any court or board to dismiss or ignore. Diane attempted, through her attorney, to issue a public apology statement that November, hoping it might soften her upcoming sentencing. But the statement conspicuously avoided any direct acknowledgement of racial bias, focusing instead on misunderstandings and administrative errors, language that satisfied absolutely nobody who'd actually lived through her 9 years of leadership. Miss Ruth, reading the statement aloud at church one Sunday, shook her head slowly. An apology that won't say the actual word isn't really an apology, she said. It's just a woman trying to manage how history remembers her, same as she managed everything else around here for years. Denise agreed completely, and we declined an invitation to comment publicly on Diane's statement, choosing instead to let the court record the video evidence. And 18 months of documented testimony speak far louder than anything Diane's lawyer could carefully phrase for damage control purposes. Diane's sentencing hearing that December drew a small crowd of Maple Ridge residents, several of whom testified briefly about the fear and financial strain her fines had caused their families over the years. Testimony the judge noted carefully before delivering restitution and probation terms alongside her guilty plea. Tyler, now 18, testified separately in a private hearing regarding the truck scratching incident and his mother's attempted cover-up, ultimately receiving a lighter juvenile disposition after cooperating fully, a small act of honesty his mother had never modeled for him throughout his own upbringing. Gary's divorce finalized that winter, and neighbors reported he'd moved out of state entirely by spring, starting over somewhere nobody in Maple Ridge recognized his name or his family's complicated history running the neighborhood he'd once called home for over a decade. By the following summer, Rachel's transparent leadership had transformed Maple Ridge into something closer to what Denise and I had originally pictured. Quarterly financial reports posted publicly. Enforcement policies reviewed by an independent committee. And fines, when necessary, applied evenly regardless of who happened to live at any particular address. Jaden made the varsity basketball team that fall, and half the neighborhood, including families who'd once avoided us entirely out of fear of Diane's influence, showed up to cheer from the bleachers. Proof that whatever damage 9 years of quiet intimidation had caused could still, slowly, heal. Amara's marigolds spread along nearly the entire front fence line by the following spring. Nobody photographing her secretly from the street anymore. Just an ordinary 7-year-old, now 8, tending her garden in the ordinary afternoon sunlight she'd always deserved without anyone questioning her right to it. Officer Ramirez became a regular presence at our family cookouts. No longer in uniform, simply a friend who'd found his way back into my life through the strangest, most public circumstances imaginable. A debt neither of us ever mentioned directly again because both of us understood it fully already. One evening that following summer, exactly 2 years after we'd first moved into Maple Ridge, Denise and I sat on our porch watching the kids ride bikes down the cul-de-sac. The same simple scene we'd once imagined the very day we signed our closing papers years earlier. I thought about Diane occasionally, not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of quiet clarity about what unchecked power does to people who mistake control for respect, and what patience, evidence, and a community finally willing to speak together can accomplish against exactly that kind of person. 14 years overseas taught me that the hardest battles are rarely won in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, deliberate accumulation of truth, patience, and people finally brave enough to stand beside you. And Maple Ridge, in the end, proved that lesson true at home as well. Mr. Retired accountant turned reluctant financial investigator joked afterward that solving Maple Ridge's embezzlement mystery had been more satisfying than anything he'd worked on during his entire professional career. And Denise gifted him a bottle of his favorite bourbon out of genuine gratitude. Rachel Kim later admitted she'd almost resigned from the board entirely before everything came to light. Exhausted by years of quietly enabling decisions she disagreed with, and credited our family's refusal to simply disappear quietly as the reason she'd finally found the courage to act instead. Mrs. away peacefully the following spring. And at her memorial, several neighbors mentioned how proud she'd been to see Maple Ridge finally become the fair, welcoming community she'd always believed it could be, decades after moving in with her late husband so many years earlier. The Osei family threw a small gathering that summer celebrating their son's acceptance into college. An ordinary joy nobody in Maple Ridge questioned or scrutinized. No anonymous complaints. No mysterious patrol cars. Just neighbors genuinely happy for each other in a way that had once felt impossible. I still keep the old case folder in a drawer at home, thick with photographs, notices, and time-stamped recordings, not out of bitterness anymore, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how much patience, documentation, and community it takes to finally hold real power accountable. Jaden, older now and taller than me in certain lights, asked once whether I'd ever regretted staying instead of simply selling the house and moving somewhere easier. I told him honestly that some fights are worth staying for, especially the ones that end up protecting more than just your own family. Denise says the marigolds along our fence remind her every spring of everything Amara refused to let anyone take away from her. small and stubborn and blooming anyway, exactly the way our entire family had learned to keep standing through 18 relentless months of quiet injustice. Officer Ramirez still calls occasionally, just to check in, and last Thanksgiving he brought his own young daughter along, watching her play with Amara. In the same backyard where an entire neighborhood's reckoning had once begun over nothing more complicated than a family simply trying to grill dinner. Maple Ridge today welcomes new families the way it should have welcomed us from the very beginning. Warmly, without hidden clipboards or quiet calculations about who belonged and who didn't. A small, ordinary neighborhood finally living up to the promise printed on its own welcome sign. Looking back, I don't think Diane ever understood that the family she tried hardest to push out would end up being the reason her entire, carefully controlled kingdom finally came undone. Proof that sometimes the quietest, most patient people are exactly the ones you should have never underestimated. And every Saturday now, when the smoke rises calm and steady over our backyard fence, I think of how far we came, not with anger, but with patience, truth, and a community that finally learned to stand together instead of looking away.